Okay, gang, so here is a introduction to conceptual frameworks, at least the way we're going to use it in this class. And I will admit at the front, this is going to be not perfect and certainly incomplete, but hopefully enough to really get you started to thinking about conceptual frameworks. I want to say at the front end, some students get really turned upside down and inside out about conceptual frameworks. So the goal here is to kind of demystify what this is and what we're really after here. So this question of what is a conceptual framework, right? If there's a one-word answer, it might be an explanation, right? So you can think of what we'll all throw in the same bucket of conceptual frameworks. You can think of kind of big overarching theories like natural law theory as a conceptual framework, right? Here's the space I'm working in. Here's the space I'm thinking in. Here are the assumptions I'm bringing to this, and I recognize them up front and see their limitations. You might think of it more narrowly within a particular domain, right? When you think back to your psychological perspectives class and Melissa's class on learning, we thought about cognitive learning theory as a conceptual framework, right? That there were a built-in set of definitions and meanings and assumptions for how some phenomenon works and how the pieces fit together. Some are thoroughly practical, and you may not have even thought of calling it a framework as yet. So for example, I'm talking to my mother and I say, oh, my 3-year-old is tantruming all the time. Of course, she's going through a phase, right? There is a conceptual framework behind that statement, which is that children go through phases and tantruming is a normal part of some certain phase, right? So just notice what these allow us to do, right? They allow us to draw on a set of definitions, a set of meanings, show how they fit together, and we can articulate it very clearly and very explicitly, all right? So to get more specific about what we mean here, beyond just a single word, right? What's a conceptual framework? The system of concepts, assumptions, expectations, beliefs, and theories that supports and informs your research. A conceptual framework explains the main things to be studied, which would include the key factors, concepts, variables, and the presumed relationship among these things, right? So it's a conception, an articulation of a conception of what is out there that you plan to study, what's the thing, right? And what's going on with these things that make up that phenomenon, right? You might think of it as a tentative theory of the phenomenon that you want to investigate, all right? So you may be thinking to yourself, oh, for God's sakes, I don't need to get all sciencey here. I don't need to get all researchy here. I'm just trying to fix a problem, address this issue that this organization is having, right? Let me tell you to be careful with that kind of thinking, because if you proceed without articulating a conceptual framework, you're not actually deciding to do a study without a conceptual framework. What you'd really be doing in that scenario is just failing to articulate the conceptual framework that you actually have. And it may be one that is limited or problematic or empirically false, all right? So that's why it's worth getting clear on, is that you are operating with a set of assumptions. You are operating with a set of concepts, right? And we need to articulate those and get them really clear on the front end and as we proceed, right? So the good news is, look, you already have one, right? It may be something that, and it likely is a conception that needs to be pounded out a bit, investigated in research, in the research literature and that kind of thing, but you already have an idea about what this phenomenon is and how it works, right? So I want to give you some examples of why, right? Let's just play a couple of thought experiments here, okay? So let's imagine we are medical researchers, right? A terrible disease has broken out, and we are seeking to understand and provide recommendations for what we should do in light of this disease. Here's the catch. We have been beamed from the 17th century France, and we're in this modern world of 2020, right? And so, you know, we begin tackling this problem with an explanation of disease, a conceptual framework that goes like this. Well, the body is made up of 4 humors. Illness happens when there's an imbalance of fluids in the body. And the body is made up of 4 humors, right? And so treating disease means getting those balances right. And, you know, we need to get the leeches out, right? So we can imagine presenting this at a conference and beginning our fundamental explanation of humorism as our conceptual framework. Well, you can bet we wouldn't get too far into the study. Certainly wouldn't get to the findings before hands would start going up in the audience, right? People would say, wait a second, where are you getting this idea? Or, hey, can we discuss some of these assumptions? Or what evidence is this explanation based on, right? Don't we already know such and such, right? Okay, so anyway, this is silly. Let's think of one that might actually be something that could be proposed, that we might hear, and indeed, you know, it has been proposed, right? So think about something more, think about something like this, right? Let's imagine someone identifies a problem that implicates employee training and development, okay? Someone might say, you want to determine how the present training model aligns or misaligns with employee learning styles, okay? Of course, you know from your psychology course that individual learning styles may or may not be a thing. There's no empirical evidence to support that claim, that particular people have particular learning styles that go across contexts, right? So again, you could do the study, but the findings would be irrelevant because a key concept that you're drawing on here is actually not a thing, right? So notice the problem here is there was a failure to explain learning based on the evidence that exists, and or there was a failure to articulate what you meant by learning style, right? These are conceptual framework problems. Again, so notice we have a problem in how key concepts were defined, right? We have another problem in how those key concepts fit together or don't, right? And then the biggest problem we have is that our key concepts, they aren't backed up by any empirical literature, or they've already been proven false, right? Or at least not strong enough to build on, right? So again, conceptual framework, the way we're thinking of it is system of assumptions, expectations, beliefs, theories that supports and informs your research project. The conceptual framework explains the main thing to be studied, key factors, concepts, or variables, and the relationship among them, right? This is where we go, all right? So I remember in graduate school, somebody telling me a funny story about they started their methods course, and a student asked, I see this requirement for a conceptual framework on the syllabus. Is that something I need to buy in the bookstore, right? This is kind of a funny thing, but the question, right, is there, right? So where do I get a conceptual framework? Okay, so I want you to think about, and this is something I'm stealing from Maxwell, I want you to think about a conceptual framework as something that is constructed, right? Not just found, right? And again, thinking of conceptual framework as a story about what you think is happening and why, right? Not just something that you go out there and grab and, you know, paste into your study, although you may find something that is quite relevant like that. But you're going to have to build this and think through it, all right? So in terms of building this conceptual framework, what you need to have on the radar screen and where you may get the pieces would be from 3 areas. Your first would be your own experiential knowledge, right? You have an interest in this for a reason. You probably know something about this, right? And don't discount that, because it actually matters, because you're going to be seeing through your own lens, right, of what you know, what you think you know. That is absolutely relevant and true, right? So some of the questions you might want to kind of ask yourself and be explicit about it, at least in thinking through it, is why did you want to study this? What's your relationship to this? What do you think is happening based on your experience? What findings are you anticipating? These are all good questions to ask and not a problem. You don't need to pretend like you're, you know, somehow some, you know, divine being who's outside the project. Of course, you are involved, right? The second place that you'll go to find your conceptual framework, or to find prefabricated pieces to build it, would be existing theory. And we think about existing theory is a set of concepts a set of concepts and ideas and the proposed relationships among these, right? And theories are intended to articulate or model something out about the world, right? So this might be something very everyday, like I said before, right? So a kid tantrums because blah, blah, blah. Well, that's a theory, right? Something more formal might be an asteroid impact caused the extinction of dinosaurs, right? This again, these are theories that are out there. All right, we've talked before about theory as a spotlight, right? Or theory as a lens that you put on to see, right? Because it's going to shine lights on or help you see elements of a phenomenon or relationships that could otherwise go unnoticed, right? And so I'm going to ask you, I put there a little quote from William James, or a summary of the quote. William James said, "You cannot pick up a rock in a field without a theory to tell you what a rock is and how it is different than a stick or some other thing," right? And so you have theories, and there are theories that exist, right, out there about your phenomenon. And the key is to articulate those and identify those and be clear about who you are drawing on or what idea you're drawing on, right? I say here, your lit review is going to help you a lot in terms of seeing what theories exist concerning your focal interest, right? The things, the phenomenon you're trying to study and how it fits together. So that's why you have a spot in that lit table that I gave you for conceptual frameworks of other researchers. You're probably going to see that, that there's some pieces out there that can really help you, right? So the other thing I wanted to get on your radar screen is not just existing theories, right? But also existing research is an important place to go for building and adapting your conceptual framework, right? So again, your lit review is going to help you a lot in terms of seeing what tools and resources other researchers have already created for you. I put Locke, Silverman, and Sperduso calls these finding valuables in research report. I like that, right? Finding valuables, you're looking for them. Well, what might be the valuables, right? Helpful terminology to use when you do your searches, right? Helpful terminology that can help you clarify what you mean in your conceptual framework, right? What is this thing I'm trying to articulate that I don't really know the word for? Maybe somebody else has named it, right? Secondly, references to important articles or chapters, right? And I've told some of you, look in the first kind of fourth of an article, and there's almost always a literature review, right? And so if this is an article explicitly about something you're studying, right, then go look at that literature review that somebody else has already done and see if there's some references in there that you need to check out, maybe something you haven't seen before, right? Some other ways that existing research can help you is in the justification for why this is an important topic, right? That we need to know about this, or we know about this in one area, but we haven't looked at this in this area, you know? Secondly, in terms of methods, right? What have other researchers, how have they gone at this problem? How have they studied this phenomenon? Can I replicate? Can I follow that? That has implications for the way I'm seeing this phenomenon, my conceptual framework, right? And then, of course, the findings of these studies have implications for my conceptual framework, right? If somebody has you know, if I'm building on someone else's finding, or if somebody's debunked kind of the way I thought something worked, that would be helpful. That would be helpful to know. All right. So I have a couple of examples here. One is from an example proposal that is from our program, and I kind of I cleared off some stuff here to make it a little more clearly. But you can see on the left side of your screen here, the problem this person began with was the university this university they're working with consistently fails to achieve its fundraising and philanthropic objectives, right? This is the problem, right? So the questions I would guess the author asked, right, is they started asking, what's my experience and understanding of fundraising and higher ed fundraising, how it works, fails to work, right? Then they probably asked, what are the key ideas, terms, phenomena, related to higher education fundraising. As they're doing their literature, they're working that out, right? What have other researchers demonstrated about fundraising practices for a university, right? Again, this comes through the literature review and the ongoing look at research, right? And then what are factors that impact fundraising in higher education? What relationship do these factors have to one another? Sorry, my pasting kind of cut off the edges there. But you can see what she ends up with here is this statement, right? The following diagram highlights the resource dependency perspective, which is a framework that's out there. The resource dependency perspective for understanding the higher education environment and building resource capacity in higher education, right? So she's got 4 key elements, each of which she's going to unpack in the text of the proposal, right? And all of these are influencing what she's saying is Newman University's advancement department, right? We could probably encourage the author to even do some additional work here in the sense of how these elements work together. Do they interact with one another in particular ways? And she may have done this in a previous document, a previous kind of outline or memo that we don't see in the proposal. Right. So here's another one that could be helpful for you. So this one began with a problem that probably sounded like a district. This is Newfoundland's principals. A district wanting to do principal development, right? But recognizing we don't really know what our principals need to know, do, and be. Right? This is a problem. Okay, so the author may have started with these questions, right? What's my experience and understanding, right, with this? Right? What are the key ideas, terms, and phenomena related to principal capacity to lead? What have other researchers demonstrated about what a principal must know to lead effectively? What are factors that impact what a principal must know, do, and be? What relationship do these factors have to one another, right? These might all be questions that our author asks, right? He ends up calling these craft knowledge and articulates the key ideas related to that phenomenon. And you can see, if you want to go look it up, it's on HGSE's dissertation library, I'm sure, right? So you can see, there's no reason to go through all the pieces there, but you can see the way that he's articulating the different pieces and how he sees them fitting together, right? And notably, again, the author in the text of the proposal is going to unpack these ideas, where they came from, how they're supported by evidence. What you're seeing here is really, it's probably more of an example of what we might call a concept map, right? Since we don't see citations and that kind of thing on here. But a great place to draw from in terms of the conceptual framework, okay? So the last piece I just wanted to mention, right, is hopefully I've convinced you a conceptual framework is important. You may still have the question of, well, how will I use a conceptual framework? Okay, so I'm proposing to you, you are already using one, right? If you have articulated a research problem, you're identifying something that is going on in the world. This is something not fully understood, something we want to know more about, but what is it exactly? And what are its parts? How do they work together, right? Look at your research problem again and ask yourself if you have done that. If you have, great, you can start modeling this. You can start articulating a conceptual frame, right? See if there's explicit elements. See if there's perhaps some implicit elements that need to become explicit, right? The second thing is you'll use it to create your research questions, and you probably already have. So start with what I'm trying to understand. Start with what you're trying to understand, and then think about the relationship between the different parts of that thing, that phenomenon that you're studying, right? So if you've drafted research questions, go back and look at them and notice that there's a conceptual framework already built in. It may be one supported by evidence, it may not be, right? And that would be important to know at this point, all right? How about designing methods? The conceptual framework helps you here, right? So how am I going to study this phenomenon? Well, I have to collect data that will tell me what I need to know about this phenomenon, right? Its different components, how they fit together, right? And this is when you have problems with you select a method that doesn't actually get at what you're trying to study, right? This oftentimes is a problem with the way somebody has conceived of the thing you're thinking of, or how the parts of what they're thinking of fit together, right? The last thing I was going to put on here, and again, we could go on about this stuff, is the idea of validity, right? So questions about validity of a study are about acknowledging the ways that I may be wrong. Yeah. And many of the validity challenges that come up are actually baked into the conceptual framework, because I have to make certain assumptions and commitments about what this phenomenon is and how the different parts fit together, right? So the more thoroughly I articulate my conceptual frame, the better I'm going to know and be able to account for the limitations of my study. All right, so there's just some ideas or some thoughts of how we're going to end up using this thing, right? I thought maybe some ideas for creating one. If you want, a great way to do this is to brainstorm. And so some ways of doing this, you can start with a concept map. Get out a sheet of paper, or if you like using Lucidchart or something like that, and just play around and try to build a little model with this thing. I'll give you some instructions from a workbook that could help you by just asking you some questions. The other thing that you may do, and it's something I like to do, is just write a little bit every day about your problem, right? Say, all right, I'm going to set aside 10 minutes and I'm going to write a little bit every day about my problem. And I keep asking questions like this. What am I trying to investigate? Exactly, right? What are the component parts of that, right? How do I see other researchers defining this thing, this phenomenon? How do the parts fit together, right? What have I not thought of yet? How am I going to get at this phenomenon, right? These are all questions that are going to push you back to a conceptual frame. Okay, so the only other thing I was just going to tell you, or just a few things worth noting, just like your literature review, your conceptual framework is going to be a work in progress for most of you, for the most part, right? So don't freak out if you feel like, oh, this feels like a draft, or this feels like it's going to need to be revised. Of course it will, right? So don't be afraid of that. That's something that is normal if a researcher is being honest. I will say this: I'm primarily a mixed methods researcher and a qualitative researcher. And so I'm drawing on something that is more qualitative paradigm to explain conceptual framework, but I will definitely go toe to toe with anybody who, says that a different, quantitative research doesn't require articulating, basic assumptions and pointing to a phenomenon or a body of literature that they're trying to address, right? And then the only other thing I wanted to mention is that one thing I just want to recognize as a limitation of what I'm laying out here is I'm not going into what we might call overarching theoretical frames, something that is actually probably pretty important, but may not be vital to what I'm asking you to do in the proposal, right? This is the kind of stuff of like, how do I think about what it means to know? Right? Or ontology, or some of these questions that maybe came up in some other courses that you've taken. If you want to know more about that, if you want to address that, if you feel like it's important to your proposal, I can definitely put some stuff in your hands that can be helpful for you. Okay, so hopefully this gets us a good start, and we'll have fun with this. Okay.